The morning air was cold enough to see your breath, and Elena Petrov sat on a wooden bench outside the audition room, rubbing her hands together. Not because of the cold, though. Her hands were shaking for an entirely different reason. She'd been sitting there for 40 minutes watching other students walk in and out of that heavy oak door. Some came out smiling. Others looked like they were about to cry. One girl had run out so fast she nearly knocked over the coat rack in the hallway. Elena pulled her worn coat tighter around her shoulders. It was her mother's coat, actually. Because her own had a broken zipper and her mother insisted she look presentable, the coat smelled like the lavender soap her mother used. And somehow that made everything feel a little less terrifying. She looked down at her hands again. They were small hands with short nails because she couldn't afford to get them done at a salon like some of the other girls waiting. There was a small scar on her left thumb from when she'd accidentally cut herself opening a can of soup last month. These were the hands that were supposed to impress one of the most prestigious music academies in all of Eastern Europe. The thought almost made her laugh. Almost. A boy walked out of the audition room, and Elena could tell immediately that it hadn't gone well. His shoulders were hunched and he wouldn't make eye contact with anyone. She felt a pang of sympathy, but also something else. Fear. If someone who looked that confident going in could come out looking defeated, what chance did she have? Elena Petrov? A woman with silver hair and rectangular glasses poked her head out of the doorway. Her voice was neither warm nor cold, just matter of fact. Elena stood up so quickly she nearly dropped her bag. Yes, that's me. You're up. The walk from the bench to the audition room felt like it took forever and no time at all. Her shoes, which she'd polished 3 times last night until they shined, clicked against the marble floor. Each step echoed in the hallway, and she became suddenly conscious of every single movement her body was making. The audition room was bigger than she'd imagined. High ceilings with ornate molding, tall windows that let in streams of dusty sunlight, and right in the center, a grand piano that looked like it cost more than her family's entire apartment. 3 people sat behind a long table facing the piano. 2 men and 1 woman, all of them looking important and slightly bored. The man in the middle, who had silver hair and a gray beard, was writing something in a notebook. He didn't look up when she entered. Name? He asked, still writing. Elena Petrov, sir. Age? 16. Previous training? Elena swallowed. This was the part she'd been dreading. 3 years at the Riverside Community Center with Mrs. Kowalski. Now he looked up. His eyes were sharp, assessing. The woman to his left whispered something to the other man, and Elena caught the tail end of it. Only 3 years? The bearded man, whose nameplate read Professor Dmitry Kozlov, gestured toward the piano. Well, let's see what you can do. Start with a C major scale, hands together, 2 octaves. Elena walked to the piano bench and sat down. The bench was the perfect height, and the piano keys gleamed under the lights. She'd never played an instrument this beautiful. The piano at the community center had sticky keys and made a weird buzzing sound whenever you hit middle D too hard. She placed her fingers on the keys and played the scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, and back down again. It was so simple she could do it in her sleep. She'd been playing scales since her very first lesson with Mrs. Kowalski. Good. Now play the Mozart Minuet in G, you know it? Yes, sir. Everyone knew the Mozart Minuet in G. It was practically a requirement for anyone who'd ever touched a piano. Elena had played it at her community center recital 2 years ago. She played it now, her fingers moving through the familiar patterns. It was pleasant and simple, like a children's song dressed up in fancy clothes. When she finished, there was silence. Professor Kozlov made a note in his book. The woman on the left tapped her pen against her teeth. The man on the right yawned, not even bothering to cover his mouth. Elena's heart sank. She could read the room. They were disappointed. Another average student from a no-name program, wasting their time. She'd seen this coming, hadn't she? What made her think she could compete with students who'd been training at elite academies since they were 5 years old? Professor Kozlov was about to say something, probably a polite dismissal, when he paused. He looked at her for a long moment, and Elena couldn't tell what he was thinking. Do you know anything else? He asked. The question hung in the air. Elena's mouth went dry. This was it. This was her only chance to show them what she could really do. But it was also risky, so risky it made her stomach flip. I've been working on something, she said quietly. On my own. What piece? Elena took a breath. Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3, The effect was immediate. The woman sat up straighter. The man who'd been yawning suddenly looked interested. Professor Kozlov's eyebrows rose so high they nearly disappeared into his hairline. "The entire concerto?" he asked, and there was something in his voice now. Skepticism, maybe, but also curiosity. "I know the first movement and parts of the third," Elena admitted. "I've been teaching myself from a recording." "A recording," Professor Kozlov repeated, like he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. He exchanged glances with the other judges. The woman shook her head slightly as if to say this was going to be a disaster. But Professor Kozlov leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. There was the hint of a smile on his face, though it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who was about to watch a train wreck and found it mildly entertaining. "Well then," he said, "show us." Elena turned back to the piano. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This was either going to be the best decision she'd ever made, or the most humiliating moment of her life. She closed her eyes and let her hands rest on the keys. In her mind, she heard the opening notes of the concerto, that cascading waterfall of sound that had captivated her the first time she'd heard it on Mrs. Kowalski's old cassette player. Mrs. Kowalski had warned her. "This piece has destroyed professional pianists," she'd said. "It's not meant for someone your age with your level of training." But Elena hadn't been able to help herself. She'd borrowed the tape and played it over and over until she'd memorized every note. Then she'd started practicing late at night in the basement of her apartment building, on the old upright piano that the building manager let her use as long as she kept the volume down. She'd practiced until her fingers ached, until she dreamed in Rachmaninoff, until the music became part of her breathing. Now, sitting in front of 3 judges who expected her to fail, Elena opened her eyes, and she began to play. The first notes came out softer than Elena intended. Her fingers trembled slightly as they found the keys, and for a horrible second, she thought she might forget everything. All those hours in the basement, all that practice gone in an instant because of nerves. But then something shifted. Maybe it was muscle memory. Maybe it was the fact that she'd played these opening measures so many times they were carved into her brain. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe she just stopped thinking about the 3 judges staring at her and started thinking about the music. Her hands steadied. The notes began to flow. The beginning of Rachmaninoff's third piano concerto is like standing at the edge of a cliff. There's a moment of stillness, almost peaceful, and then suddenly you're falling, cascading runs of notes that tumble over each other like water rushing downstream. It's beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Elena's fingers moved faster. She leaned into the piano, her whole body becoming part of the instrument. In the basement of her apartment building, she'd had to play quietly so she wouldn't disturb the neighbors. Mrs. Novak in apartment 3B had complained once about the noise, even though Elena had been playing it barely above a whisper. But this piano, this beautiful grand piano, was meant to be played loudly, meant to fill a room with sound, and for the first time in her life, Elena didn't have to hold back. She hit the keys with force, and the piano responded like it had been waiting for her. The melody soared through the audition room, bouncing off the high ceilings and the tall windows. Her left hand provided the foundation, steady and sure, while her right hand danced across the upper register, picking out the intricate melody that made this piece famous. From the corner of her eye, she could see Professor Kozlov. He was no longer writing in his notebook. His pen was frozen in midair, forgotten. He was watching her hands with an expression she couldn't quite read. The woman judge had stopped tapping her pen. She'd set it down on the table and was leaning forward, her mouth slightly open. But Elena couldn't think about them now. The music was demanding everything she had. There's a section in the first movement where the right hand has to play rapid octaves, while the left hand maintains a completely different rhythm. It's the kind of thing that looks impossible on paper. Mrs. Kowalski had shown her the sheet music once and pointed to that section. "Professional pianists practice this part for months," she'd said. "Some never get it right." Elena had practiced it for 6 weeks straight. Her hands had cramped so badly some nights that her mother had to massage them before bed. She'd gotten it wrong hundreds of times, maybe thousands. She'd wanted to give up more times than she could count, but she hadn't given up. And now her hands knew what to do. The octaves came out clean and precise. Her left hand kept its rhythm without wavering. The 2 parts wove together exactly the way Rachmaninoff had intended, creating a sound that was somehow both chaotic and perfectly ordered. She could feel sweat forming on her forehead. Her arms were starting to ache. This piece was physically exhausting, like running a marathon with your fingers. But she couldn't stop now. She was in too deep and the music was pulling her forward. The melody shifted into a quieter section, and Elena let her playing soften. This was her favorite part, actually. After all the technical fireworks, there was this moment of genuine emotion. It reminded her of something, though she could never quite put her finger on what. Maybe it was the feeling of walking home on a winter evening when the streetlights were just coming on, or the way her mother hummed while cooking dinner, something familiar and comforting and a little bit sad all at once. She poured all of that into the keys. The notes came out like someone telling a secret, quiet and intimate. In this moment, it wasn't about impressing the judges or getting into the academy. It was about the music itself and what it meant to her. The quiet section ended and the piece built back up to its full intensity. Elena's hands flew across the keyboard again, tackling a series of difficult arpeggios that spiraled up and down the piano like smoke. Her fingers were starting to feel hot, almost burning from the friction against the keys. There was a technical passage coming up that she'd never quite mastered. Even last night practicing in the basement, she'd stumbled over it. It required her hands to cross over each other at lightning speed while maintaining perfect clarity in every note. She'd resigned herself to the fact that she'd probably mess it up. But something different happened today. Maybe it was the better piano. Maybe it was adrenaline. Or maybe it was just luck. Whatever it was, her hands executed the passage flawlessly. Every note rang out clear and true. She almost wanted to laugh with relief, but she kept her focus. The finish line was in sight. The first movement was building to its conclusion now. The tempo increased, the volume swelled, and Elena gave it everything she had left. Her whole body rocked with the rhythm. Her feet worked the pedals, adding depth and resonance to the sound. Her arms moved in wide arcs, pulling music from the piano like she was drawing water from a well. And then, suddenly, it was over. The final chord rang out in the audition room, powerful and definitive. Elena held the keys down, letting the sound sustain, watching the strings vibrate inside the open lid of the grand piano. Then slowly she lifted her hands and let the chord fade naturally into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Elena sat frozen at the piano bench, suddenly aware of how hard she was breathing. Her heart was racing and her hands were shaking again, worse than before. The room felt too quiet after all that sound. She could hear the old radiator in the corner clicking and hissing. She didn't want to turn around and look at the judges. As long as she didn't look, she could pretend it had gone well. She could hold on to the feeling of those last few minutes when everything had felt perfect. Once she turned around and saw their faces, reality would come crashing back. But she couldn't sit facing the piano forever. Elena took a deep breath and turned around on the bench. Professor Kozlov was staring at her with an expression she'd never seen on anyone's face before. His notebook had fallen to the floor and he hadn't even noticed. The woman judge had tears in her eyes, actual tears, and she was shaking her head slowly like she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. The other man was gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. The silence stretched out, becoming uncomfortable. Elena started to worry that she'd done something terribly wrong. Maybe she'd been too loud. Maybe her interpretation was all wrong. Maybe playing such a difficult piece when she'd only been asked for Mozart was seen as disrespectful. She opened her mouth to apologize, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. But before she could speak, Professor Kozlov did something that, according to Academy legend, he hadn't done in 15 years. He stood up from his chair, and then slowly and deliberately he began to clap. The sound of one person clapping in a large room is strange. It echoes differently than applause from a crowd. Each clap is distinct, separate, and somehow more powerful because of it. Elena sat at the piano bench, completely stunned. Professor Kozlov was standing now, his hands coming together in steady, measured applause. His face had transformed from that stern, bored expression into something else entirely. There was wonder in his eyes and maybe a little bit of disbelief. The woman judge stood up next, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. She joined in the applause, and then the third judge rose as well. All three of them were standing, clapping for her, and Elena felt like she might faint. This wasn't how auditions were supposed to go. She'd been to enough recitals and competitions to know the protocol. Judges made notes, gave polite nods, maybe said thank you when you finished. They didn't stand. They definitely didn't applaud. Where did you learn that piece? Professor Kozlov's voice cut through the applause as he stopped clapping. He moved around the table, walking toward the piano with quick, purposeful steps. Elena's throat felt tight. "I taught myself, sir. From a recording." "A recording," he repeated, coming to stand beside the piano. Up close, he was taller than she'd expected, and his presence was intimidating. "What recording?" "Mrs. Kowalski, my teacher. She had a cassette tape of Vladimir Ashkenazy's performance. She let me borrow it." Professor Kozlov's eyebrows rose. "Ashkenazy's 1985 recording?" "I think so, yes." The tape was pretty old. It had tape hiss, and sometimes it would warp a little if you played it too many times. The professor exchanged a look with the woman judge, who had come closer as well. She was shaking her head, but she was smiling. "How long have you been working on this piece?" Elena tried to remember. "About 8 months, I think. Maybe 9. 9 months, the professor said quietly, as if testing the words. "And where did you practice?" This was the embarrassing part. Elena looked down at her hands, which were still trembling slightly. "There's a piano in the basement of my apartment building. An old upright that's probably 50 years old. The building manager lets me use it at night when nobody's around." "At night," Professor Kozlov repeated. "Yes, sir. I work during the day at my uncle's grocery store, stocking shelves and helping with inventory. I go to school in the morning, work in the afternoon, and practice at night, usually from 10 o'clock until midnight, sometimes later." The room had gone quiet again. The third judge, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, had joined them by the piano. He was looking at Elena like she was some kind of puzzle he was trying to solve. "You work full-time and go to school?" he asked. "Not full-time. 20 hours a week. My family needs the income. My father works at the textile factory and my mother teaches at the elementary school, but with 3 kids, it's tight. My younger brothers are still in school, so I help out where I can." She wasn't sure why she was telling them all this. It just seemed to spill out of her. Maybe because she was still riding the high of having actually made it through the piece without a major mistake. Professor Kozlov walked around the piano, running his hand along its polished surface. This instrument cost more than most people earn in 5 years. It's been perfectly maintained, tuned twice a month, played by some of the finest students in the country, and yet, you've just performed one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire after learning it on an old upright in a basement. He stopped walking and looked directly at her. How is that possible? Elena didn't know how to answer that. She'd never really thought about it in those terms. "I just really love this piece," she said finally. "When I first heard it, it was like something clicked inside me. I had to learn it. I couldn't not learn it, if that makes sense." "It makes perfect sense," the woman judge said softly. She had kind eyes, Elena noticed now. "What's your teacher's name again?" "Mrs. Kowalski. Anna Kowalski." Professor Kozlov nodded slowly. "I know Anna. She was a promising pianist in her youth. She could have had a career if life hadn't gotten in the way. She's a good teacher for basics, but she doesn't have the training to teach a piece like this. She told me not to try it," Elena admitted. "She said it was too advanced, that I'd develop bad habits trying to teach myself something this difficult. But I promised her I'd be careful. I watched my hand position in a mirror, and I broke it down into tiny sections, just a few measures at a time." The professor was silent for a long moment. Then he said something that made Elena's heart skip a beat.
"Play something else for us, sir?"
"Something simpler. A Chopin nocturne, perhaps. Do you know any?" Elena nodded. "I know the nocturne in E-flat major. Opus 9, number 2. Perfect. Play that." She turned back to the piano, confused but obedient. The Chopin nocturne was beautiful but much easier than the Rachmaninoff. Why would they want to hear something simple after she just played something so complex? But as her fingers found the opening notes, she began to understand. The nocturne was about subtlety, not power. It was about the space between notes as much as the notes themselves. It required a delicate touch, emotional maturity, and a deep understanding of phrasing. Elena played it the way she'd always imagined it should sound. Like a lullaby, but one tinged with melancholy. Like remembering something beautiful that was gone. Her mother used to sing to her when she was little, before the long work hours and the stress of raising 3 children had worn her voice down to something rough and tired. This piece reminded Elena of those songs. When she finished, Professor Kozlov nodded, satisfied. "You're not just technically gifted," he said. "You understand music emotionally. That's much rarer than technical skill. Technical skill can be taught. What you have cannot. Elena felt her face flush. She wasn't used to compliments like this. The woman judge spoke up. We need to discuss your training history more thoroughly. You said you've only had 3 years of lessons with Mrs. Kowalski. What did you do before that? Nothing formal, Elena said. My grandmother had a piano, an old thing that was missing a few keys. I used to play around on it when I visited her. She showed me where middle C was, and I figured out some simple songs by ear. But she died when I was 11 and the piano was sold. I didn't touch another piano for 2 years until I saved enough money to pay for lessons at the community center. Professor Kozlov sat down on the edge of the table, which seemed remarkably casual for someone who'd been so formal just minutes before. Elena, I'm going to ask you some questions and I need you to be completely honest with me. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Why do you want to study at this academy? Elena took a breath. This was the question she'd rehearsed 100 times in her head, but now all her prepared answers seemed hollow. Because I want to be better, she said simply. I know I have gaps in my knowledge. I know my technique isn't perfect. I know there's so much I don't understand about music theory and history and interpretation. I want to learn all of it. I want to be the best pianist I can possibly be. And what would you do if I told you that you're not ready? That despite what we just heard, you lack the foundational training that our program requires? The question hit her like cold water. Elena felt her stomach drop. Was this it? Was this the part where they told her she was good but not good enough? I'd ask what I needed to do to get ready, she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. And then I'd do it. Professor Kozlov smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes. Good answer. Professor Kozlov walked back to the table and picked up a folder. He flipped through several pages, making notes with his pen. The woman judge leaned over to whisper something to him, and he nodded. The silence felt like it lasted forever. Elena stood by the piano, not sure if she should sit down or keep standing. Her legs felt wobbly, and she realized she hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. She'd been too nervous. Now the adrenaline was wearing off, and she felt lightheaded. Finally, Professor Kozlov looked up. Miss Petrov, we'd like to offer you a full scholarship to the Warsaw Academy of Music. The words didn't register at first. Elena heard them, but they seemed to bounce off her brain without actually going in. A full scholarship. To the academy. The academy that rejected 80% of applicants, most of whom had been training since they were children. I'm sorry, what? She managed to say. The woman judge smiled warmly. You're in, dear. Full tuition, room and board, everything covered. Elena felt tears spring to her eyes before she could stop them. She tried to speak, but her throat had closed up. All she could do was nod, over and over as the tears spilled down her cheeks. There are conditions, Professor Kozlov said, but his voice was gentler now. You'll need to work harder than you've ever worked in your life. You're coming in with gaps in your foundation that we'll need to address. Music theory, sight reading, classical repertoire knowledge. You'll essentially be doing 2 years of coursework in one. I can do that, Elena said quickly, wiping at her eyes with her sleeve. I'll do whatever it takes. I know you will. That's why I'm also offering you something else. Private mentorship. You'll study with me directly, in addition to your regular classes. 2 hours twice a week. The third judge let out a low whistle. Dmitri, you haven't taken a private student in over 10 years. I know, Professor Kozlov said, not taking his eyes off Elena. But I haven't heard anyone play like that in 20 years. Raw talent like this comes along once in a generation if you're lucky. I'm not going to let it slip away. Elena felt like she might actually faint now. Private lessons with Professor Kozlov were legendary. Students talked about them in hushed tones. He'd trained 3 concert pianists who now performed with major orchestras around the world. And he was offering to teach her. Classes start in September, the woman judge said. That gives you 4 months to prepare. We'll send you a list of pieces you should familiarize yourself with, and some theory books you should study before you arrive. September, 4 months away. Elena's mind was already racing. She'd have to give notice at the grocery store, though maybe she could pick up extra hours between now and then to save money. Her brothers would need new school supplies in the fall, and her mother's birthday was in August. She'd have to figure out how to help with expenses even while she was studying. As if reading her mind, Professor Kozlov said, the scholarship includes a small monthly stipend for personal expenses. It's not much, but it should cover your basic needs. We find that students perform better when they're not worrying about having enough to eat. That was another weight lifted, and Elena felt fresh tears threatening. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much. Don't thank us yet, Professor Kozlov said, but there was amusement in his voice. Wait until you've survived your first semester. Now go on. I'm sure you have people waiting to hear how it went. Elena nodded and gathered her bag. As she walked toward the door, the woman judge called out, Elena? That was truly extraordinary. What you did today, don't ever lose that fire. I won't, Elena promised. She walked out of the audition room in a daze. The hallway seemed brighter somehow, or maybe that was just her imagination. The other students waiting on the benches looked up at her with curiosity. She must have looked strange with her tear-stained face and probably wild eyes. She didn't care. Elena made it halfway down the hall before she had to stop and lean against the wall. Her whole body was shaking. She'd done it. Actually done it. Against all odds, with her 3 years of basic training and her basement practice sessions, she'd impressed one of the most prestigious music academies in Europe. She thought about her mother, who'd given her that coat to wear today. Her father, who'd taken extra shifts at the factory so they could afford her lesson fees. Mrs. Kowalski, who'd believed in her even when Elena wasn't sure she believed in herself. She couldn't wait to tell them. The walk home took an hour on the bus, and Elena spent the entire time staring out the window, replaying everything in her mind. Had it really happened? It felt like a dream. But the acceptance letter the woman judge had handed her on the way out was real. She'd checked it 5 times already, touching the academy's official seal to make sure it was actually there. When she finally reached her apartment building, she ran up the 4 flights of stairs instead of waiting for the ancient elevator. She burst through the door, breathless and flushed. Her mother was in the kitchen, stirring something on the stove. She turned around, and the look of anxious hope on her face nearly broke Elena's heart. Well? Her mother asked. Elena couldn't speak. She just held up the acceptance letter, her hands shaking so badly the paper rattled. Her mother read it once, then twice. Then she set down her spoon, walked over and pulled Elena into a tight hug. I knew it, she whispered fiercely. I knew you could do it. Her younger brothers thundered into the room wanting to know what was happening. When they found out, they started cheering and jumping around the small kitchen. Her father came home an hour later to find the whole family celebrating, and Elena had to tell the story 3 times, with everyone interrupting to ask questions. That night, after dinner and after her brothers had gone to bed, Elena lay awake in the room she shared with them. The streetlight outside cast shadows on the ceiling. She could hear her parents talking quietly in the next room, probably discussing how they'd manage with her gone, how proud they were, how their lives were about to change. Elena thought about the grand piano she'd played today, and how different it had felt from the basement upright. She thought about Professor Kozlov and his offer of mentorship. She thought about the academy, with its high ceilings and marble floors and tradition of excellence, but mostly, she thought about September, and everything that would begin then. The next few months passed in a blur. Elena worked as many hours as she could at the grocery store, stocking away money even though the scholarship would cover most things. She studied the theory books the academy had sent, struggling through concepts that she'd never encountered before. Chord progressions, harmonic analysis, counterpoint. It was like learning a new language. Mrs. Kowalski gave her extra lessons free of charge, focusing on sight reading and filling in some of the technical gaps in her training. You're going to be around students who've been doing this their whole lives, her old teacher told her. Don't let them intimidate you. You have something they don't. You have passion. Elena practiced every night in the basement, saying goodbye to the old upright piano that had been her companion for so long. She played the Rachmaninoff piece one last time, pouring everything she had into it. The neighbors didn't complain, not even Mrs. Novak in 3B. In late August, Elena packed a single suitcase with everything she owned. It wasn't much. Some clothes, her theory books, a framed photo of her family, and the worn cassette tape of Ashkenazi's performance that Mrs. Kowalski had given her as a going-away present. Keep it, her old teacher had said. Remember where you came from? The night before she left, her family threw her a small party. Her mother made her favorite meal, and her father gave a toast that made everyone cry. Her brothers promised to write her letters, though Elena suspected those promises would fade after the first few weeks. You're going to do amazing things, her mother told her at the train station the next morning. I've always known it. Elena hugged her tight, breathing in that familiar lavender scent. I'll make you proud. You already have. The train pulled away from the station and Elena watched her family get smaller and smaller until they disappeared completely. Then she turned to face forward, toward whatever was waiting for her in the city at the academy and her new life. The dormitory room was smaller than Elena had imagined. 2 narrow beds, 2 desks, 1 window that looked out over the courtyard. Her roommate, a girl named Katarzyna from Krakow, had already claimed the bed by the window. Her side of the room was filled with expensive luggage, framed certificates from piano competitions, and what looked like a brand new laptop. Elena set her single suitcase on her bed and tried not to feel inadequate. "So you're the scholarship girl," Katarzyna said, not unkindly, but not warmly either. It was just a statement of fact. The one who played Rachmaninoff at her audition. Word traveled fast, apparently. "That's me," Elena said. "Everyone's been talking about it. Professor Kozlov taking a private student. It's kind of a big deal." Katarzyna examined her perfectly manicured nails. "I've been training at the National Conservatory since I was 6. My teacher studied under Vladimir Horowitz." Elena nodded, unpacking her few belongings. She recognized the subtext. Katarzyna was establishing the hierarchy, making sure Elena knew that scholarship or not, there were levels here. The first week was overwhelming. Elena attended music theory classes where everyone else seemed to already know concepts she was encountering for the first time. She sat in on master classes where students casually discussed composers and performances like they were talking about the weather. During breaks, the other students clustered in groups, talking about summer programs in Vienna, private concerts at prestigious venues, teachers whose names Elena had only read in books. She felt like an imposter wearing borrowed clothes to a party where she didn't belong. Her first private lesson with Professor Kozlov was on a Thursday afternoon. She arrived 15 minutes early and sat outside his studio, her hands sweating. Through the door, she could hear someone playing Liszt with flawless technique. When the door opened, a tall boy walked out, barely glancing at her as he passed. "Elena, come in," Professor Kozlov called. His studio was lined with books and sheet music. A beautiful grand piano sat in the center, its black surface gleaming. Awards and photographs covered one wall, pictures of the professor with famous musicians and conductors. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the piano bench. "Play me something, whatever you want." Elena chose a Bach prelude, something she'd been working on. She made it through 3 measures before Professor Kozlov stopped her. "Your hand position is all wrong. You're tensing your shoulders. Your pedaling is imprecise." He moved to stand beside her. "These are exactly the bad habits I was worried about. You taught yourself without proper guidance, and now we have to unlearn everything and start over." Elena felt her face burn. "I'm sorry, I don't apologize. Just listen and learn." His voice was stern but not cruel. "You have an extraordinary gift for interpretation and emotional expression. But technique matters. If your foundation isn't solid, you'll hurt yourself trying to play at the level you want to reach. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Good, now let's begin again. From the top." The lesson was brutal. Professor Kozlov corrected everything. Her posture, her breathing, the angle of her wrists, the pressure of her fingers. By the end of the 2 hours, Elena felt exhausted and discouraged. All that practice in the basement. All those hours she'd thought she was improving, and apparently, she'd been doing it wrong. Walking back to her dorm, she passed the student lounge where several classmates were gathered around a piano. One of them, a boy with dark curly hair, was playing the same Rachmaninoff piece she'd performed at her audition. He played it perfectly, technically flawless, not a single note out of place. But something was missing. Elena couldn't quite name it, but the performance felt hollow somehow. Beautiful but empty, like looking at a photograph instead of the real thing. "That's Victor," Katarzyna said, appearing beside her. "He's won like 5 international competitions. He's the favorite to perform at the end-of-year showcase." "He's very good," Elena said carefully. "Good?" Katarzyna laughed. "He's perfect. We're all competing for those showcase spots, you know. Only the top 5 students get to perform. It's a huge deal. Talent scouts come, people from orchestras and recording labels." Elena watched Victor finish the piece to enthusiastic applause from the other students. The end-of-year showcase. She hadn't even thought that far ahead yet. She was just trying to survive her classes. The weeks turned into months. Elena worked harder than she'd ever worked in her life. She woke up at 5 in the morning to practice before breakfast. She attended all her classes, took detailed notes, stayed up late studying theory. Her private lessons with Professor Kozlov were demanding and often frustrating. But slowly, painstakingly, she began to rebuild her technique. "Better," he said one day in late October, after she played through a Chopin etude. "Much better. You're starting to unlearn the bad habits." It was the closest thing to praise he'd given her, and Elena held on to it like a lifeline. But the self-doubt was always there, whispering in the back of her mind. Everyone else seemed so confident, so polished. They talked about their futures like they were certain of success. Elena wasn't certain of anything except that she was always one step behind. In November, Professor Kozlov announced that auditions for the end-of-year showcase would be held in January. Students could prepare any piece they wanted. It was the most important performance of the year. Elena knew what she wanted to play: the Rachmaninoff Concerto, the complete first movement, the piece that had gotten her here in the first place. But when she mentioned it to Professor Kozlov, he shook his head. "You're not ready for that yet," he said firmly. "Pick something else." "But I played it at my audition." "You played it with passion and raw talent. That was enough to show me your potential. But if you want to perform at the showcase, you need to demonstrate that you've grown, that you've learned proper technique. The Rachmaninoff will reveal every flaw. Choose something that will highlight your strengths." Elena felt like she'd been slapped. The Rachmaninoff was her piece. It was the reason she was here. And now her teacher was telling her she wasn't good enough to play it. That night, she called home for the first time in weeks. Her mother answered on the third ring. "Elena, how are you, sweetheart? We've been waiting to hear from you." "I'm fine," Elena lied. "How's everyone there?" They talked for a while about her brothers, her father's job, the neighborhood gossip. Normal things, safe things. Elena didn't mention her struggles or her doubts. What would be the point? Her family had sacrificed so much to get her here. She couldn't let them know she was failing. After she hung up, Elena sat alone in her dorm room. Katarzyna was at some social event that Elena hadn't been invited to. The building was quiet. She thought about the basement piano in her apartment building, about Mrs. Kowalski's cramped teaching studio, about the cassette tape she'd listened to hundreds of times. She thought about why she'd started playing in the first place, not for competitions or scholarships or showcases, because the music made her feel something. Because when she played, she could express things she didn't have words for. Somewhere along the way, in the stress of trying to fit in and prove herself, she'd forgotten that. Elena pulled out her theory notebook and started making a list of pieces. Not what would impress the judges, not what would prove she belonged here, but what she actually wanted to play, what spoke to her. The next day in her lesson, she told Professor Kozlov she wanted to play Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique. It wasn't as flashy as the Rachmaninoff, but it was deeply emotional and would showcase the musical maturity she'd been developing. Professor Kozlov studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Good choice. Let's begin." The months of preparation were intense. Elena practiced the Beethoven Sonata until her fingers knew every note by muscle memory. But she also did something else. She stopped comparing herself to the other students. She stopped worrying about whether she was good enough, polished enough, sophisticated enough. She focused on the music. January came, and with it, the showcase auditions. Elena performed the Pathetic Sonata in front of a panel of professors. When she finished, there was a moment of silence, and then Professor Kozlov smiled. Actually smiled. "You've grown," he said simply. 2 weeks later, the showcase roster was posted. Elena's name was on it. 5th spot out of 5, but she was there. The night of the showcase, the auditorium was packed. Elena peeked out from backstage and saw her parents in the 3rd row. Her mother in her best dress. Mrs. Kowalski was there too, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief even though nothing had happened yet. When it was Elena's turn, she walked onto the stage. The piano sat there waiting. The audience was a sea of faces, some familiar, most not. Somewhere out there were talent scouts and orchestra representatives and people who could change her future with a single decision. But as Elena sat down at the piano, she thought about none of that. She thought about the music. She thought about the basement where she'd learned to play. She thought about that cassette tape and the moment she'd first fallen in love with the piano. And then she began to play. Not for the judges or the scouts or even for her family. She played for herself. For the girl who dared to learn Rachmaninoff in a basement. For the part of her that believed music was worth any sacrifice. The notes filled the auditorium and Elena was home.